What would you do if the person you once loved, the one you thought had completely disappeared from your life, moved in right next door? This isn't a story about rekindled love. It's about the quiet ways we survive, the people who hold us up, even when they no longer belong to us. You know, sometimes life quietly arranges the cruelest coincidences. Not loud, not dramatic. Just two people, once inseparable, now standing awkwardly in front of each other, pretending they're strangers. Mark never thought his night shift would lead him to this. He's the type of guy who doesn't ask for much. A small apartment, enough space for one, in the middle of Tokyo's endless neon loneliness. After every exhausting shift at the convenience store, he comes home to the same cold walls, the same silent clock, the same ramen cup waiting in the cupboard. It's a routine that doesn't leave room for surprises. Until that day, as Mark trudged wearily down the hallway of his old, half-forgotten building, he noticed something he hadn't before. A moving truck. Cardboard boxes stacked in a neat, nervous pile. A couple young, newly married perhaps, dragging their life into the apartment next to his. Mark didn't think too much of it. People come and go. That's just how Tokyo works. But as he stepped into his apartment, keys jangling against the door like they always did, he heard it. Voices arguing. Not violent, not explosive. Just sharp enough to slice through the thin walls. A man's irritation. A woman's tired replies. Mark paused, listened, wondered, then shrugged it off. Not his business. It wasn't until the next morning that everything started to feel wrong. Bleary-eyed from another sleepless night, Mark locked his door and turned. And there she was. Haruka. The girl who used to sleep on his shoulder in college lectures. The girl who cried in his arms the night she said goodbye. The girl he hadn't seen in 5 years. Now, standing in front of him like a scene from some cruel movie, holding grocery bags and wearing a nervous, polite smile meant for strangers. For a few unbearable seconds, neither of them said a word. It was her husband, Mark realized with a sinking heart, who stepped out behind her, smiling, casual, completely unaware. He greeted Mark like a normal neighbor would, introduced himself without knowing the man standing in front of him already knew everything about the way his wife used to laugh, about the small scar on her wrist, about the promises they broke. Haruka's eyes met Mark's. He could see it in them. The same shock, the same flood of memory crashing over her. But they said nothing. They smiled like strangers do. They bowed politely like Tokyo demands. And life moved on. Except it didn't. Because from that day forward, Mark noticed everything. The way Haruka looked thinner than she used to. How her smiles seemed practiced. How her husband's voice, though cheerful in public, turned sharp behind closed doors. Every day when Mark came home, he passed by their door, sometimes hearing whispers, sometimes hearing silence heavier than any words. And every morning, there she was again, carrying groceries alone, watering the small dying plant on their balcony, avoiding his gaze, then meeting it when no one was looking. They didn't speak of the past, not once, but their eyes did. Every stolen glance said what their lips wouldn't. I didn't expect this. I didn't want this. How did we end up here? At first, Mark tried to stay away, tried to remind himself, this is someone else's wife now, someone else's life. It's none of his concern. But the universe has its own sense of humor. The meetings became more frequent. Coincidences piled on top of coincidences. a shared elevator, a late-night convenience store run, a brief conversation in the stairwell about the weather, about trash collection schedules, about anything except what was really on their minds. And slowly, Mark started to see it. The sadness hiding behind Haruka's practiced kindness, the quiet exhaustion in her movements, the silent plea in the way she lingered just a little too long outside her door. He wondered if her husband noticed, if he cared, if she cried alone in the same way Mark sometimes did, staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering when it got this hard just to keep breathing. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic reunion, just two people quietly orbiting each other's loneliness. Neither of them brave enough or foolish enough to call it what it really was. Fate, punishment, a second chance disguised as coincidence. Or maybe just life reminding them that some stories don't end cleanly. They just wait, quietly, behind thin apartment walls, until someone knocks, until someone breaks the silence, until someone says, "Are you okay?" And that night, that knock would come. Not loud, not rushed, almost hesitant. He didn't even have to guess who it was. Somehow, deep down, he already knew. When he opened it, there she stood, Haruka. In her hands, a small plate of food, something home-cooked, something warm, something she clearly didn't make for herself. Mark stepped aside, wordlessly, and opened the door for her to enter. The room was the same as always. Messy, empty, cold. A space reserved for one person. They sat across from each other, on the small table he barely used. Between them, the dish she brought. Stir-fried vegetables, miso soup, a quiet attempt at kindness wrapped in nostalgia. They ate, they talked, about nothing, about everything. About the present, the neighborhood, the absurdly strict garbage sorting rules in Tokyo. And slowly, as the minutes stretched and the walls between them softened, the conversation shifted. To old stories. The time they got caught in the rain after skipping class. How Mark had once burned her birthday cake so badly it set off the fire alarm. How she used to doodle on his notebook margins when she was bored. They laughed. Not loudly, not carelessly, but the kind of laughter that feels like exhaling after holding your breath too long. Mark watched her carefully, between bites and silences. The way she looked down when she smiled. The way her hand absent-mindedly touched the ring on her finger, as if trying to remind herself who she was now. She wasn't the Haruka he used to know. Not entirely. Back then, she had dreams bigger than apartments, bigger than men, bigger than Tokyo itself. Now, her dreams seemed folded away somewhere small and hidden. But beneath it all, beneath the tired eyes and polite smiles, Mark saw something unchanged. Sadness, loneliness, a quiet desperation for connection. Maybe not for love, maybe just for someone to see her again. The conversation stretched long into the night, bending under the weight of old emotions neither of them dared name. At some point, she drank a little too much. Just one small glass of plum wine. But for Haruka, it was enough. Enough to peel back the layers she wore like armor. "You know," she said, voice soft, words slowing with each sip, "when I first saw you, I thought I must be dreaming. I thought, maybe I shouldn't knock. Maybe it's better to leave it alone." She looked at him, eyes glimmering with something halfway between grief and gratitude. "But then I thought, if I didn't knock, I'd keep wondering forever." Her hand reached across the table, not bold, not romantic, just searching, just needing to feel something real. Mark didn't pull away. They sat like that for a moment, two old ghosts holding hands over cooling plates of food, laughing at things no one else would understand. No promises, no apologies. Just quiet warmth shared between two people who thought they'd lost it forever. Haruka laughed softly, her head tipping slightly as if the weight of the world had finally grown too heavy. Do you remember? You always said, "If life gets too hard, come find me. I'll make you ramen." Mark smiled, not because it was funny, but because it hurt. "I didn't think you'd take it literally," he said. Outside, the city hummed on, oblivious, indifferent. Inside, two people sat in the soft glow of kitchen lights, holding on to something they couldn't name, afraid to let go. But life, as always, wasn't finished with them yet. Because even through the thin walls, even through the hum of the fridge and the warmth of half-finished memories, they heard it. The door next door, opening, closing, heavy footsteps, a voice slurring with drink. Haruka's husband. Her fingers slipped from Mark's hand, like a secret retreating into darkness. Mark didn't stop her. He couldn't. But as she left, she paused, just briefly, just long enough to look at him with eyes full of things she couldn't say out loud. And then she was gone. Moments later, the arguing began again, low at first, then sharper. Mark sat alone in his apartment, listening, because something told him this wasn't the end of it. In the days that followed, Mark found himself moving through his life differently. After each night shift, as the sun crept over Tokyo's exhausted skyline, he'd pass by their door, sometimes catching the echo of harsh words, sometimes meeting her husband's tired glare, sometimes hearing nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. But Haruka? She was always there, somehow. They bumped into each other more often now, in the hallway, on the stairs, outside the building where she smoked quietly, something she never used to do. Each time, her smiles grew softer, less forced. Each time, they stayed talking a little longer. Other times, it drifted into something heavier, lonelier, the kind of conversations only two people who had loved and lost could truly understand. And slowly, without either of them noticing what had happened, they became something again. Not lovers, not quite friends, something in between, something complicated and fragile. She started coming over on days when her husband worked late. Small visits, harmless on the surface, helping Mark clean, reorganizing his cluttered kitchen, laughing at how little his life had changed. She'd bring groceries sometimes, cook meals she barely touched herself. They'd watch old shows together, the ones they used to joke about back when the future seemed less cruel. And in those moments, Mark noticed how her guard fell away piece by piece, how her laugh, when it came, sounded real again, how her eyes stopped darting toward the door every time footsteps echoed in the hall. It wasn't love rekindled. It was something quieter, a kind of tenderness born from shared exhaustion, from knowing too much about someone's past to pretend they're just a neighbor now. He didn't press her. He never asked why she stayed. He just stayed close. After every argument, after every slammed door, after every long, heavy silence, Mark was there, quietly, patiently, offering small kindnesses without demand, listening without judgment, standing beside her without crossing lines neither of them could uncross. Sometimes, kindness is the most dangerous thing you can offer someone who's forgotten what it feels like. And Haruka, she started to remember. Their meetings became less accidental, more intentional. Soft glances exchanged in crowded hallways, unnoticed by the world, but deeply understood between them. it wasn't romantic. Not really. It was survival. Two people holding on to the thin thread of connection in a city that chews people up and spits them out alone. Two people remembering, piece by piece, how to breathe again, how to laugh again, how to simply exist without apology. Neighbors on paper, something more in practice. They never said what they both knew, that the lines between them were blurring, that Haruka's smiles were starting to belong to Mark more than to the man waiting behind her door. But some things didn't need to be said. Not when kindness speaks louder than words. Not when silence feels safer than confessions. And through it all, Mark stayed. Not because he expected anything. Not because he wanted to rewrite their history. But because sometimes, staying is all you can do for someone who's forgotten they deserve better. He didn't need her to love him again. He just needed her to remember she was still allowed to be loved at all. Time passed, not slow, just the steady, unnoticed passing of days that blend together when you're living quietly, carefully. Mark never asked Haruka why she stayed with her husband, and Haruka never explained. They understood each other without needing to spell things out. Some choices aren't made with logic. Some ties aren't broken by will alone. But still, the small things continued. After every argument next door, Mark would find some small excuse to be there, to check in, a cup of tea, a borrowed book, a meaningless question about apartment maintenance. It didn't matter what excuse he used, she understood. And every time, Haruka would let him in, not just into her apartment, but into the quiet, aching corners of her life where she didn't have to wear her practiced smiles anymore. In those moments, something unspoken grew between them. Not love, exactly. Not romance. Something softer, something sadder. A kind of companionship born from survival, from shared history, from the silent recognition that in this vast, indifferent city, they were each other's only witness. They never crossed any forbidden lines. Not physically, not explicitly, but there are connections deeper than touch. Glances held a little too long, silences shared without discomfort, words spoken softly, like confessions disguised as conversation. He was the one she trusted with her exhaustion, her small daily joys, her quiet breakdowns she couldn't afford to have anywhere else. And Mark? He let himself care? More than he should have. More than he promised himself he would. Because even if they couldn't go back to who they were, he could still be this for her. A place of safety. In the moments after the arguments, when her husband stormed out and the apartment felt too big, too cold, it was Mark who stayed. Mark who helped her clean up shattered dishes, who listened without interruption, who sat beside her until the shaking stopped. Their bond became something else, a quiet, unwavering companionship, a promise never spoken aloud. You don't have to face this alone, not anymore. But in this imperfect, complicated space between them, something precious existed, a tenderness that didn't demand more, a loyalty that expected nothing, a connection stronger for its restraint, neighbors, old lovers, something beyond their title. And slowly, Mark stopped waiting for her to leave her husband. He stopped wishing for things to change. Instead, he learned to be grateful for what he could give her. Moments of peace in a life too full of noise. Small kindnesses that reminded her she was still worthy of them. They walked through seasons together like this, quietly, carefully, sharing umbrellas in the rain, trading tired smiles on the stairwell, watching the city change around them while something between them stayed achingly constant. And if anyone asked, they'd say they were just neighbors. But they knew better. They were soulmates, not in the romantic sense, not in the way stories usually tell it, but in the quiet, enduring way two people can belong to each other through understanding alone. They weren't destined for some grand, beautiful love. That wasn't the gift life had given them. Instead, life gave them this: a place to rest, a person to understand them, a hand to hold in the silence between heartbeats. And in a world where so many people walk through life unseen, that was enough. More than enough.